Across southern Latin America, the names of the victims of military dictatorships are etched in memorials. As well as a crackdown in their own countries, in the 1970s, the military also shared information to hunt down opponents across national borders. They said it was a war on terror. It was called Plan Condor. An old car workshop in the south of Buenos Aires in Argentina. It's now a museum. It was once a secret detention center. The sound from the train tracks opposite helped survivors later identify its location. Amongst the victims here, Argentines, Uruguayans, Bolivians, Chileans and Cubans. This was the center for Plan Condor in Argentina. It's called Automotores Oletti.
Cuando alquilan los represores, se presentan como personas común y corriente, como empresarios, y que la vivienda y todo el sector de abajo va a ser utilizado como depósito de mercadería en tránsito. En realidad es un eufemismo, digamos 40 años después está bien claro que el depósito era un depósito humano, la mercadería en tránsito eran seres humanos y el tránsito era el tránsito a la muerte, ¿no? De alguna manera. Han sido muy irónicos y muy sádicos en su terminología, ¿no? Esto que hablábamos hoy, hasta el día de hoy los represores están muriendo muchos de viejo y siguen con el sadismo de no contarnos a los familiares qué es lo que hicieron con los restos de los cuerpos de nuestra familia.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Nat Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist, Leonard Peltier advocate, whiskey sipper. Come on, I'm hyping you, Dave.
Hell yeah.
David
I'm
Griscom.
here.
David Griscom. David's looking annoyed. Just like, come on, just introduce me already, man. Trying to get to my business. On this week's program, Shahid Buttar. He's an activist, an attorney, a member of the DSA, and he is running an incredibly serious and for real challenge to the sclerotic, discredited, and failed leadership of Nancy Pelosi. He's challenging her in the Democratic primary for the House of Representatives, representing that district in San Francisco. We're talking with him. Then, an interview I just finished with the great Ana Kasparian, host of No Filter, co-host and producer on The Young Turks. We talked about the right-wing war on freedom, legislation across the country from Republican state legislatures to repeal and eliminate the ability for people to engage in activism. How that correlates with incitement in Republican politics and right-wing media, and then a little bit on media bias and what would a strategic self-assessing left actually look like. Can we all just please be a little bit more like Cornel West? Plus 500 days of imprisonment of Lula da Silva, the most prominent political prisoner in the world. I'm very proud we've covered this story from the beginning. We will continue to do so. Peter Beinart drops truth on CNN about apartheid Jim Crow Israel. We'll unpack the political ramifications of Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, the changing dynamics of the Middle East, and media coverage in the postgame. Friends Don't Let Friends Vote Lib Dem in the UK, edition 50,000, as Jeremy Corbyn's brilliant new maneuver on a no-deal Brexit has revealed the pure naked cynicism of the Lib Dems, the so-called centrist bloc, even members of the increasingly silly British Green Party. Sorry to say, guys, let's just keep it real. The threats for peace in Northern Ireland will revisit Good Friday with some archival sound of Martin McGuinness, and How does the occupation, the siege, the tearing of the Indian constitution in Kashmir fit with a broader history of BJP, RSS, and Hindu fanatical politics in an age of far-right extremism, and an introduction with Jeremy Johnson to Gene Gebser and integral theory, plus, of course, the debunk. We've got a hell of a lot of show for you. But first, let's start by going to Argentina, where last week's primary election results might be, in the words of Dilma Rousseff, light at the end of the tunnel for the crisis and the rise of far-right extremism that has dominated Latin America over the last couple of years. The story of the modern wave of Latin American far-right politics always needs to go back to the Obama administration supporting the 2009 coup in Honduras. You cannot understand anything from the challenges and the white supremacy exploited by Donald Trump with regards to the refugee crisis generated in Honduras without understanding that coup, as well as the broader rollback of pink tide governments across the region with active U.S. support. Argentina, President Macri was elected in 2016, running on a hard right, austerity-driven marketeer program, and the results have been predictably disastrous. Rates of growth have slowed, poverty has increased, the economy and prospects for normal Argentinians are quite bad. And that meant that in the first round of voting, and there will be a runoff in October, that Alberto Fernandez led Marcio Macri 47 to 32.1%, winning in the primary. Alberto Fernandez is a former chief of staff to Nestor Kirchner, who was the leader of Argentina in the early aughts, who challenged the World Bank and IMF, who implemented some very important stimulative policies. Fernandez had a falling out with Cristina de Kirchner, who was Nestor Kirchner's wife, and then after he served, she served 2 terms as president as well. This joining of their political prospects is significant because it means a sort of realliance inside the broader centrist and center-left populist bloc, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But first, years of austerity under Macri have devastated the Argentinian economy and wiped away the significant anti-poverty gains of both Kirchner's administrations. Kirchner drastically reduced poverty under her governance. Argentina saw a 71% decline in poverty between 71 and 81%, according to the World Bank. Argentina is a heavily indebted country, and Macri recently accepted a hefty $57 billion package from the IMF in return for the implementation of deep austerity cuts and a rollback of government aid. Markets immediately rebelled against the first round of voting, which favored Fernandez and Kirchner. And we've already seen the stock market tank, the pesos drop dramatically, and there are the never subtle signals from the Western financial class and Wall Street that they want to strangle democracy in Argentina and keep the Macri program going, even though it has been so damaging for so many of Argentina's citizens. And of course, this has a broader history going back to Operation Condor, which was a CIA-backed regional effort of far-right regimes across Latin America in the 70s and early 80s to murder people on the left of every category, from center-left to Marxist. This was a mass killing regimen with the backing of the CIA.
We'd have been in trouble.
We'd have been in deep trouble. And particularly and specifically in Argentina, the Argentinian military junta disappeared thousands of students and political dissidents. After the return of civilian government, Argentina struggled with debt for decades, a significant portion of which was accumulated under the military junta. There was a Great Depression in 1998 and 2002, following years of neoliberalism in the 1990s. Argentina fell into a depression and accepted loans from the IMF and private capital. This was what the Kirchners reversed. And it's very important to understand Christina de Kirchner and Nestor Kirchner, because on one hand, they sent the IMF and the World Bank packing, which is extraordinary and had a huge benefit to Argentinian workers. They invested in social programs. They backed some efforts in civil society and labor, and they also had significant gains in broader social inclusion rights for gay and lesbian people as well as women. Now, there are corruption allegations against Christina de Kirchner, and there are criticisms of the government that I will just say two quick things about. One, we're living in the real world, and we need to push for and fight for any type of broad left win in Argentina. So I would support the Alberto Fernandez Christina de Kirchner ticket unreservedly, full stop. We live in the real world. Period. And those governments had significant gains and significant contributions to alleviating and fighting poverty and challenging international capital. That being said, there is no question, and I will touch on it more another time, that some of the allegations around the Kirchner government are both juiced by the right wing. There was an attempt to strip her of an ability to run and imprison her as well, which parallels so many other cases. Of course, most particularly Lula. But I will say that some of the allegations around her might be more substantive and more serious relative to the just absolute farces that we've seen out of Brazil. That said, I still entirely support her and Fernandez. I cannot emphasize that enough. And in fact, Alberto Fernandez, as a candidate, has visited President Lula in prison and called for his release. And the Kirchners both were at the center of a pink tide effort that cumulatively across Latin America brought 70 million people out of poverty, and Argentina's record is central to that. So yes, there were absolutely mistakes and problems, and there is a critique from the socialist left in Argentina. The Kirchners also don't fit neatly inside the other political manifestations of the left inside the pink tide. Lula and the Workers' Party is in many respects the world's youngest social democratic socialist party in that vein, rooted in labor, rooted in movements and liberation theology. Chavismo was an attempt to update socialist principles in the 21st century and really had some very radical efforts in terms of the economy and decentralized democracy at its best. The Kirchners come from the Peronist tradition, which is not a left tradition, to say the least. It has left components, and they certainly implemented and were internationally heralded for their courage, as I say, against the financial institutions and their social programs. But the lineage that they come from is not of the left. They have been coalitioned with the left. They are part of a left tendency of Peronism. But Peronism is more akin to military authoritarianism. So they fit in a broad pink tide coalition that spanned everybody from Evo Morales and the Cocoa Union to Chavismo, to Rafael Correa. There is broad distinctions inside this grouping on social policies, on relative more or less repression, relative more or less conciliatory to international capital. And the Peronist tendency is distinct within it. So that's important history. At the same time, international capital, of course, was violently opposed to the Kirchners because of, as I said, their significant challenge to it. This includes vulture hedge funds and investment funds in the United States that hold Argentinian debt. And the United States Supreme Court, in a stunning decision in 2014, literally ruled that the sovereign government of Argentina needed to pay off a vulture fund in the United States. And of course, they were able to do this because of the massive relative power that the United States has relative to Argentina. So this is extremely important for understanding the ongoing economic colonialism of that relationship. There's been a collective punishment of the Argentinian people through successive World Bank and IMF programs, the same programs that were pushed to an extreme in the 1990s and led to the depression of the 1998 to 2002 era. We need to unite the left, from Argentina to the US to the UK, to Greece and Spain, to fight for debt relief, to fight for serious social programs, and a future that is written by the people, not international finance. And that is why I absolutely support the Fernando and Kirchner ticket, because we situate it in a political, historical context, defeating Macri, who of course has his own swirls of human rights abuses and corruption allegations and all of the rest, with an increasingly authoritarian tendency that coalesces with his complete acquiescence and acceleration of international capital. We need a beachhead against the far right and against financial hegemony in Latin America, and it looks to be that the Fernando Kirchner ticket is the one to do it. Do you guys have anything to add on this?
So, the capital flight that happened in Argentina following the primary election is a really great example of how ridiculous our global economic system works. When you're reading this in the United States, a lot of people in Bloomberg, they're reminding everyone that, yes, a lot of people are moving their money out of Argentina just because they have been following what's been going on there in the past 6 months. But all of these people together taking their money out of the country has massive effects on its domestic economy. So this is one of these questions that if you're very serious about democracy, you need to start asking yourself, is this a kind of rational system that we want to be living under, where people have control over massive amounts of resources, basically aren't paying attention to what's going on to a country, or also are very much against any kind of left program that's working for poor people in general, that they're able to basically effectively punish an entire nation of people for exercising their democratic will? Personally, I think it's absolutely ridiculous, especially when you recognize that Argentina was hit so hard by the financial crisis that was caused by the United States. Right. So it's like Wall Street basically is already punishing them. Argentina's having to pay for their greed in the first place. And then again, they hit them anytime they try to do anything different in their country.
Absolutely. All right, let's get to the shout out.
And we're back.
Who is that? Is that Kyle Klinsky?
I don't want to get greedy, but if Danarchy could give us a shout-out beat, that would be ill. Top of the line professionals. Let's get to the shout-out. Shout-out.
Oh.
Shout-out.
A flashback.
That's
I didn't
creepy.
mean to hit
People have been asking for that. People have definitely been asking for that. Let's give it a minute.
Shout-out.
This is out of control.
Shout-out. That's creepy. Shout-out.
So Ethiopia has planted over 350 million trees. I'm going to quote now. This is an incredible project, I have to say, of the Ethiopian government, which will have major public health gains for the people of Ethiopia because of just basic air pollution. And it's also a contribution to the international effort against the ecological crisis and acceleration of climate change. I'm quoting now from The Guardian. About 350 million trees have been planted in a single day in Ethiopia, according to a government minister. The planting is part of a, quote, National Green Legacy Initiative to grow 4 billion trees in the country this summer by encouraging every citizen to plant at least 40 seedlings. Public offices have reportedly been shut down in order for civil servants to take part. This project aims to tackle the effects of deforestation and climate change in the drought-prone country. According to the UN, Ethiopia's forest coverage was just 4% in the 2000s, down from 35% a century earlier. Ethiopia's Minister of Innovation and Technology tweeted the estimates of the number of trees planted throughout the day. This also reminds me of the great leader and revolutionary Thomas Sankara, who we've had the honor of speaking with a couple of times on this program, with the absolutely essential and amazing Milton Alamati. Everybody should be following all of Milton Alamati's work. This is something Sankara did in Burkina Faso, which, of course, after changing the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright men, one of his initiatives was tree planting in the villages. So the incredible ecological footprint of this, but also the sort of like mobilizing of people in such a bottom-up integrated effort is essential, both in this case for reforestation, for dealing with the ecological crisis, for enhancing public well-being and health in Ethiopia, But this is also precisely the type of initiative that allows for people to be communicating, to be coordinating, to really see just all of the things that human beings are actually capable of in a project like this. So shout out to them, Ethiopia. This is an awesome initiative, and that is the shout out. All right. So we're going to get to Shahid Buttar in a minute. First, I just want to say you should definitely become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. Look forward to longer pitches soon. Next week, we're off. We have a vacation week, and we're going to actually take one. Usually, we tack an extra show on so we don't miss a single show. But we're actually going to take a proper break next week. There will be a show that is released in the public feed of the podcast. Liz Franzik, and I believe her co-host. We're talking with the co-host of TrueAnon. We're going to go deep on some wild Jeffrey Epstein stuff. So that will be a publicly released show. Then there will be two. There's actually going to be one with Liz Franzik on an actual strategic response to Tucker Carlson. And then another with Brett from Rev Left Radio on what are the actual grounded applicable relevancies of insurgency literature. Whether we're talking about a Ho Chi Minh or the Black Panthers, what do those things have to teach us in such radically different material environments? So we're not either reading it, maybe we're reading it as historical interest, or are there things that can actually be drawn on and applied, but not just sort of fetishizing and kind of play acting, but actually what can about those things can be real? I'm looking forward to that conversation. That will be for patrons. There's a full education for you in the backlog that runs the gamut from introductions to leftism, logic, to CLR James, to deep political histories of Turkey, Iran, Jamaica, and so on, plus the post games, which are just really shows in and of themselves. We have a lot of fun on. For 21 and above patrons, I do regular group calls. And we have the new illicit history. It's Lula versus Brazil's Monsters. It covers ground that people will be familiar with from the show, but it actually spans going back to the 60s, modern Brazilian political history, just as the one we just did that is now available on YouTube on Patrice Lumumba, the Congo, Belgium, and the CIA. Vic's doing amazing work on that. Forrest is doing amazing work on that. We appreciate all of you. The next goal, which we need to get to as soon as possible, is 3,000 patrons. I think as of showtime, we're at 2,624. So we need to keep it coming. It's my birthday month, so do it, guys. Patreon.com/TMBS. There's also definitely tickets left. Not actually that many, but we're not at sellout capacity as we were in New York and LA. But we're still going to give you a fire live show, and there's tickets available. You should come see us with Chuck Mertz and Gene Bajlan, August 24th at the Lincoln Hall. We just finished up the outline yesterday, actually, game planning that show out. And there's going to be some things we haven't done at live shows before. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're absolutely not going to want to miss this one. I'd go snag your tickets. The VIP tickets, double check. Those actually might be sold out. We've sold a ton of those, actually. So there's going to be a lot of people coming and hanging out with us to meet and greet. Go get your tickets. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Shahid Buttar. He's going to defeat Nancy Pelosi. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is the next congressman from, I should have asked what district he will be representing, but he is, which district? He is the next congressman from the 12th district in the state, the great state of, come on, I want to do this. The great state of California is a constitutional attorney who works at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a grassroots activist, an artist, and candidate challenging Nancy Pelosi in the Democratic primary, Shahid Buttar. Shahid, I hope I did that right, and thank you so much for being here.
You did. Thanks so much for bringing me on, Michael.
Shahid, why are you challenging Nancy Pelosi?
I'm challenging Nancy Pelosi because we have a Democratic Speaker of the House who appears to be very favorable towards conservative policies. We can see that demonstrated in Speaker Pelosi's reticence to seek executive accountability of a criminal president. We can see that reflected in Speaker Pelosi's unilateral and unprompted attacks on young progressives in the House, opening the door for our criminal president to follow on, demonizing those figures, including Representatives Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, Omer, and others. Race baiting, effectively, is what the president was doing. And for better or worse, Speaker Pelosi opened the door to those attacks. You can see the same concerns demonstrated in Speaker Pelosi's support for Trump's foreign policy from Venezuela to Palestine. And you can see that same support for conservative interests demonstrated particularly in Speaker Pelosi's unilateral, unprompted adoption of Republican fiscal austerity rules. These were accounting rules known as the PAYGO rules that effectively discriminate against progressive spending interests like affordable housing or health care, and instead bias federal spending towards military, industrial, fraud, waste, and abuse. And ultimately, I think that San Francisco deserves a representative in Washington who is aligned with our city's proud values instead of working to undermine them.
What's your background in terms of where are you coming from? What shapes your politics and who you are and what you're about?
Great question. Thanks for asking. I'm an immigrant to the United States. My family came to rural Missouri when I was 2 years old from Britain, and they had moved to Britain before I was born from Pakistan. And in those two migrations, we fled first religious persecution in Pakistan and then racial discrimination in the UK. As an immigrant to the United States who's had the opportunity to train and teach at Stanford Law School, I have a very deep commitment to our nation's founding and fundamental principles. Freedom and liberty are not abstract concepts to me. And, my view towards the First Amendment reflects this very, I would say, deep-seated patriotism. I take a great deal of inspiration from our founding commitments. I think the rest of the world has as well. And that identity as someone who has grown up in the United States as part of a family with one foot outside it has been, I think, for me, very pivotal in helping me place, frankly, current events in context, whether we see that through the lens of, my essential lens when evaluating policy is the extent to which it is liberatory or instead of promotion of social control. And I think that's something that being a post-colonial advocate helps me see through that lens more easily. Other things that have shaped me included the national security state that emerged in the years since Bush invaded Iraq. I was in law school at Stanford from 2000 to 2003. So the particular set of events that I had a chance to encounter and observe very closely when I was studying what passes for law in our country included the Bush versus Gore decision, the 9/11 attacks, the passage of the Patriot Act, and the invasion of Iraq. And it was hard to live through that set of events studying antitrust law, which was my original focus when I started law school. I wanted to bust big corporations for the government when I got done, and I got the job that would have given me a chance to do that, except the Bush administration had effectively shut down antitrust enforcement, and it's never, frankly, been resuscitated since. And at the same time, a constitutional crisis erupted under our feet, which also has not been addressed since. And so I've basically dedicated my career over the last 20 years to defending not only privacy in the face of the mass surveillance regime, but ultimately the freedom to dissent. And democracy is what I've been defending in the last 20 years in the face of a national security state promoted by administrations of both corporate political parties that I fear is doing great damage to democracy in America.
That's 100%. And so can you connect that? Because you talk about, San Francisco values, and I know what you mean in the sense that it's not my home, obviously, but I definitely have some connections to people in the broader Bay who have incredible commitments and are part of very deep traditions. And then at the same time, the parlance of modern politics, and I think what another aspect of what Pelosi's representing and what has also created so many, atrocities in terms of gentrification and lack of housing and so on is the industry that you would be representing to some extent. in Congress, and overlaps also with your whole history in terms of antitrust and so on. How would you relate, and of course, surveillance and national security issues as well? How would you position yourself relative to the Silicon Valley industry as a congressman representing that part of the world?
Also, another great question. I'm running to represent one of the seats of the global tech industry, and I'm running for that seat having been, for the last 5 years, the director of grassroots advocacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is sometimes described as the conscience of Silicon Valley. In some respects, I find that description to be somewhat inapt because we spend as much time, frankly, fighting tech firms as we do fighting the government, frankly. And so I would be entering Congress as a committed skeptic of technology companies, particularly the big ones, and a skeptic of the national security state that has largely co-opted many of those large tech firms into being either willing or unwilling participants in mass surveillance. A couple of things to note here is that there's a vast distinction between the interests of the owners of tech firms, like the founders who have this very storied set of libertarian principles, and that tends to be consistent across many of the companies, and the workers at these companies, which have very divergent interests from their bosses. And it's a lot like any other industry in that respect, except that even the workers in this industry are highly compensated. They also happen to be quite sophisticated and aware, for instance, that no amount of economic privilege is going to insulate them from the vagaries of the mounting global climate crisis, which is one reason why I'm very confident that we'll have an opportunity to gain a great deal of support from workers in the industry, even though the industrial interests that employ them might have a great many reasons to fear the likes of me entering Congress, because it might, for instance, resuscitate antitrust enforcement. We might, for instance, ask the questions that you haven't heard in oversight hearings to this point. How much money are each of the platforms making from collaboration with the FBI, with the NSA, with the DEA? These are questions, frankly, that the American people don't know, and we deserve to.
100%. As part of that, and I love the distinction that you're drawing here, that really speaks to my Marxist ears of, even regardless of the compensation levels, there's a structure between worker and boss that is kind of a technical function, not necessarily, even if you are relatively better off. And how do you position yourself in terms of this sort of broader movement, most particularly with Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign? I do think that is this sort of, from an electoral point of view, that's definitely the core site, the most important intervention in politics today, creating a Sanders presidency. And as part of that distinction is some actual sense that, on one hand, it's so commonsensical, and it definitely is not particularly radical, but there is a democratic socialism to it. There is the notion that, the economy should be a site of democracy as well, and that big unaccountable industries and companies, Amazon, Walmart, Exxon, so on, they really need to be brought to heel in a broader sense of not just necessarily reformed, but really fundamentally rethinking how we relate to them. And of course, things like totally decommodifying healthcare. Do you position your politics that way? Or you sort of, would you kind of fall inside that broader movement and tradition? And is that sort of more broadly how you conceive your politics in a kind of democratic socialist way?
Absolutely. I do describe myself as a democratic socialist, and I want to offer a couple ideas here that might introduce some tension with the concept as it's traditionally construed. I am a socialist, which is to say I favor putting people before profit and communities before corporations. A couple examples of how that shows up in my policy vision is, for instance, a commitment to dismantling mass incarceration, as well as mass surveillance, the central target of my work for so many years. It also involves wanting to not only defend human rights that are in crisis, for instance, at our nation's border, but I also want to expand human rights to include healthcare, housing, and food in the United States. I'm also, though, I say very frequently that as a constitutional lawyer who has my whole career has been effectively under an age of mounting authoritarianism, invisible, I think, to many people around whom it has grown, who have grown very alarmed in the course of the last 2 years, or 3 years, I suppose, as a tyrant has taken the helm of our federal government. I like to say that I put the D back in democratic socialism. And what I mean by that is our country has at least 4 independent, compounding threat vectors that are eroding our democracy under our feet. Now, I'll try to do this quick, and we can explore any of them that might be particularly interesting. But the first is just the front door, and that's voting rights. The Supreme Court a few years ago struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and it basically opened the door to Republican state legislatures to start attacking voting rights. That's exactly what they've done. You don't need a computer to hack an election. Our elections have been getting hacked out in the open by vote suppression tactics promoted by the right wing for the last several years, and which is to say, our democracy is under a direct assault. And I'm not, whatever the Russians are doing, the people I'm worried about hacking our elections are Republicans, and they're using the law.
This is just a ding 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 shofar like dance hall bass line for our show. We've said that so many times. It's all happening here. The Republicans, the oligarchs, it's right in front of your face. Please, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I resonated with that so much, but sorry, go ahead.
No, please. And I love that the resonance for you took the form of a bass line.
Yes.
As a DJ, that's right down my alley. So we talked about the voting rights in the front door. Our democracy, though, is also crumbling from each of its corners. And so just to explain some of those, fair and independent courts were described by the founders of our country in the Federalist Papers as the fulcrum on which liberty rests. Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court. We don't have anything resembling equal justice. I've spent years of my career trying to, working at the American Constitution Society, develop a pipeline of progressive jurists who, when we had a Democratic administration in the White House, we could find no support for. Even Presidents Obama and Clinton have generally appointed prosecutors and defense lawyers and big corporate lawyers to the bench, and they might be prosecutors of color, but they're no less predatory than their other people who've done the same work. And so the right wing has been stacking the courts with right-wing ideologues. Democratic presidents have been stacking the courts with ultimately right-wing ideologues, and our courts are lost to us as meaningful avenues to seek justice. So we've got majoritarian rule through the voting process that's falling apart. We have counter-majoritarian rights that are falling apart because we can't get equal access to the courts. 2 other dimensions here, just to grip. One is mass surveillance, and it's not privacy that I'm worried about as much as it matters. What I am concerned about is freedom of conscience, because privacy is what you call it if you have the privilege of raising your voice, regardless of what happens to you. If you don't have privilege, if you are a vulnerable person, what other people call privacy is ultimately agency and autonomy. And without agency and autonomy for individuals, we can't have a democracy for our society. It requires individuals having agency. It's why we have a First Amendment, which incidentally includes not only your right to speak, but also your right to hear, which is why in an age of surveillance, all of our First Amendment rights are threatened and undermined, whether you have anything to say or not. Edward Snowden has made the point, and he's right. If you think you have nothing to hide and therefore nothing to fear, it's because you have nothing to say, and that's true. But further, even those of us who have nothing to say still have a right to hear from all of the people who are silenced, knowing that they're being watched. That is the essential part that I think a lot of people don't understand about surveillance. Is it has nothing to do about security. It has nothing to do about, it has a great deal to do with privacy, and unfortunately, unfortunate ways. But the point is that it is democracy destroying, and that's why I am committed to stopping it. And then finally, the fourth way our democracy is crumbling is through executive secrecy. You could chalk that up to CIA torture. You could talk about the classification scheme. So much of our government is secret. And in all of these different ways, it is not just the socialist vision that I aspire to. I also aim simply to preserve what vestiges remain of our democracy and to build and expand on them.
This is some of the closest parallels, that you could actually look to, frankly, my politics. People are very curious about these questions. And I think, frankly, what you're articulating of this radical expansion and redefinition in the economic sphere, and maybe, I don't know, I would push that extremely far. And I am a capital S socialist in those realms. But
Right on.
the way
Right
you
on.
would fuse that with really recognizing that in the domains of open exchange, accountability of power, privacy, and the seamlessness of holding those things in terms of government overreach, but also corporate overreach, and how seamless those things are in the tech economy, you're spelling out something here that I think is like the perfect fusion of the politics of our time. And also, I want to say, I have to give a shout out to Harvey K, because I know he's smiling right now at this, like, that this radical socialism that also builds and expands on the best of what we've always done.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I certainly aim to me, as I was saying before, my lens is sort of what's liberatory and what's the locus of social control, and I've always, my whole career and life, really just gone toward the liberatory options. For most of my life, that's branded me a radical leftist. And if you were, for instance, to poll my law school classmates, I finished law school in 2003, I'm pretty certain I was probably the very least likely person in my law school class to run for office, if only because, my positions were untenable in that day and age. But as particularly a generation of millennials got shafted in the 2008 financial crisis and radicalized by a Democratic president allying himself with the banks, exposing the bipartisan corruption of our system and the extent to which it basically is an extraction complex to take wealth from people and give it to corporations. I think that entire generation's radicalization was visible first in the Occupy movement, and a lot of people claimed at the time, and maybe some in retrospect, that the movement was unsuccessful, but they didn't understand that it was just the jab. Bernie 2016 was the hook, AOC in 2018 was the uppercut, and I aim to land the knockout blow on bipartisan corporate rule. And we are going to recover a working party for working Americans. And the Democratic Party, that's ultimately what we are here to do, not only to recover and liberate a single congressional seat for the people of San Francisco, but ultimately to end the Democratic Party's complicity in corporate rule.
I love it. I have two foreign policy questions, two global solidarity questions for you. So first, before you go in the last couple of minutes, but I want to cover Middle East and Brazil. Obviously, with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and the denial of entrance to Israel, I don't need to really set it more than that. I mean, frankly, the question is that, and I think it's pretty clear from what you've already said what some of the answers will be. But how do you see being a voice, in Congress that really is about, in fact, democracy, justice, and human liberation and security and well-being for all in the Middle East? And I really underline for all, because obviously there is, in reality, not only no contradiction between wanting to uproot Jim Crow systems, and this would enhance everybody's well-being and security if we had actual democratic function there. And so what does it look like for you as a congressperson? I mean, will you support BDS as an example?
I was going to go there as my first point. Before, in the service of expanding rights for all, I want to particularly defend rights of Americans and the First Amendment the attacks on First Amendment rights to participate in boycotts or divestment sanctions campaigns do threaten the rights of Americans, core fundamental constitutional rights, and the idea that we would trade our own rights in order to entrench a foreign proxy power that exports human rights violations, that is to some extent responsible for the militarization of our own police departments here in the United States, it is a perfect example of what Brother Malcolm described as our chickens coming home to roost. We have long been committed to lawlessness in the international sphere, and every time someone dies at the hands of a police officer in the United States, that usually you can trace that indirectly at least to paramilitary training, which disproportionately comes from Israel. And our military aid to that country, which we then leverage to, for instance, double down on our own authoritarian practices here. You might think about that as security laundering.
Yep.
And that's exactly what we've been doing with Israel for decades. The only thing I would say here about, to broaden the context, is that we should never sell weapons to countries that abuse human rights, period. That includes Saudi Arabia, right? I want to make very clear that this is not a matter of the identity of the country. It is about its practices. And any country that practices human rights abuses, we should not be supporting. Now, the irony here, of course, is that our own country for so long has been an engine of human rights violations. The CIA's litany of crimes include not only invasions and assassinations and mining harbors and removing democratically elected leaders across the global south. The CIA also has a hand in climate change, which we can get to. I suspect the question about Brazil might bring that into sharp focus. We have intelligence agencies that have, for decades, as we were warned by a former president they would do, that have been assaulting democracy in America, our own rights and liberties, and the resource opportunities for people around the world. So I would say that the fight to promote human rights, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Venezuela, ultimately has to take us through Langley. And we need an accountability, long overdue accountability, for our own national security agencies in order to allow any meaningful sense for democracy or rights to emerge in other countries where they might be threatened.
All right. I'm synchronized. So obviously, I mean, if you're familiar with this show, I mean, Lula da Silva, for me as a political prisoner, is something that matters deeply in and of itself. And I think that this is also something that has global implications. I think that if you did not have a politically motivated imprisonment, you would actually, instead of having one of the most dangerous, destructive leaders in the world, you'd actually have an incredible beachhead against this global authoritarian trend. And I love that you there's no question that there's a DOJ role in Lava Jato, which I'll get to in a second. And I have to say, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, who's actually clearly called for Lula to be free, and Ro Khanna, who's made some strong statements, I appreciate that a number of good Congress people have signed some letters, but I've actually found the leadership, particularly on Lula and all that represents, to actually be quite weak, frankly, given what he's achieved and the atrocity of the case and the U.S. role in it. So I guess my question would be, first of all, would you campaign on and be a voice for freeing Lula and even annulling the 2018 election to the extent you can register that? And more broadly, how do you see that situation in terms of, the type of leadership that we should be thinking about in terms of globally coordinating against this far-right trend?
Great question. So I would certainly support freeing Lula. I wouldn't support annulling the election, only because that would require, ultimately that's a U.S. intervention in a foreign state system. And I understand that it's an attempt to unwind our prior intervention, but I don't know if the remedy to interventions is more, right? But I will say this, and as to your question about will I campaign on it, I do certainly campaign on human rights, and I frame those across context. I do talk about usually Venezuela and Palestine more than I do Brazil and Palestine, but the shoe fits insofar as, Bolsonaro, when he visited Washington, he visited the CIA headquarters. He met with a human rights abusing torturer who now leads the agency, an international criminal who should be in prison, not leading a federal agency by the name of Gina Haspel. As you talk about the leadership's disappointing response to the set of events, I think the way we can explain it is simply by the U.S. rule. The Democratic leadership is not, has frankly never in my lifetime been inclined to cross swords with the intelligence agencies. And the idea that the CIA is helping steer Bolsonaro, who incidentally is deforesting the Amazon at unprecedented rates, under whose administration something like 500 million bees have died in the last year. There is ecocide happening in Brazil, and our interests are inevitably implicated. And the fact that we let the CIA off the hook, not only for human rights abuses, but also for ecocide, is frankly unthinkable to me as someone who pays enough attention to recognize how these dots fit together. The CIA is, for instance, not only the agency that lied about weapons of mass destruction that dragged us into a war in Iraq, as Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said at the time, to get oil. We don't just use the CIA to degrade human rights abroad. We use the CIA to execute resource plunder. And when we pillage other countries for their oil, it's not just the rights of the human beings there who die that are implicated. The rest of us also have to deal with the mounting global climate catastrophe that the CIA has been driving and accelerating for the last 50 years. And, I often say that our criminal president's worst acts are ones that we don't even know about yet. It always takes a decade or two for each administration's worst crimes to become public. I fear that some of this president's worst crimes will relate potentially to Brazil not just the support for Bolsonaro, but the litany of downstream harms to human rights, to the environment, to minorities that have already resulted and that will predictably continue as long as we continue to intervene illegitimately in the affairs of other countries.
So I could see that you have a few differences with Nancy Pelosi.
I have just a few.
I could see that it's a sort of slightly... I feel actually that would be great. I would love you to get interviewed by Chris Matthews, where you say, I mean, I think you're basically saying the same thing. What would look, this is incredible. I hope if it's useful for your campaign, maybe we could interview you again in the coming months, because I would like to talk with you more about any number of the topics we've already discussed. And I'd like to talk with you about Kashmir. I'd like to talk with you about Pakistan. I'd like to talk with you about how to democratize technology. But in the last, I would really love to do that. We support you fully. In the last minute, I mean, what's the final? I think, frankly, for this audience, you don't need to give a final pitch, but what way could they help you make this happen?
Appreciate that. Anybody can visit us online. Our website is shahidforchange.us. We're on all of the major social media platforms at Shahid for Change. Our hashtag is Shahid versus Pelosi. Shout-outs on social media help. Contributions to the campaign help, and introducing us to people who either have social media presences or resources in their pocket who might care about human rights, that also helps. We have over 4,000 supporters from across the country, every one of the 50 states, plus D.C. and Puerto Rico. If the issues that we're talking about, compel some of your listeners, I do hope that they see fit to help support our campaign. We are challenging the leading corporate fundraiser in the House. And I am a propertyless immigrant. Like I'm not a well-resourced person. I've never made, decisions to chase money. And the only reason I'm in this position to seek this seat is because of the support of so many people around the country. We have volunteers from coast to coast. Would welcome people to sign up to volunteer, and just keep organizing wherever anyone is at. If you share any of these concerns, meet your neighbors, talk about your concerns. Find where they overlap and make shared plans to do anything. And I don't even care what that thing is. Just find anything to do in your local sphere with your neighbors to raise your voices. That is the recipe. That is how we get out of this mess. That's how we breathe. That's how we breathe to being the new in the shell of the old.
Shahid Buttar, the guy that we need to elect for the 12th District of California. I appreciate your time immensely. Thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to talk with you. Keep up the great work.
My pleasure. Thank you. I got to say, guys, I mean, I had a very positive impression from, sort of engaging with him a bit on social media and seeing what they've emphasized. And for a while, his Avi was a picture of Cornel West, so I already really liked him. And I trust people who've referenced him. And I thought it would be a great interview, and I thought it would be good. That exceeded my expectations. So I'll put it.
Yep, good job.
That definitely exceeded my expectations. That was...
Yeah, I mean, it was incredible. He's able to hit so many networks of power, too, that we have to dismantle, which is so important.
So the compassion and the systems thinking fused. Whew. That's somebody you want in Congress. That's somebody you want in leadership. That's excellent. So what we're going to do is we have this interview to get to with Ana in a few minutes. We have a few stories we're going to cover. First, we're going to do the gem. Are we ready for the gem? With Crisco.
So the past few days, or I guess now a little bit over a couple of weeks, there was this massive yield curve inversion, which we've talked about before, basically has been a signal that precedes most recessions basically for the past 50, 60 years. Now, of course, this is just a measure. It does not create a recession, so there's been a lot of debate about whether or not there's going to be a recession in the future in, the media like Bloomberg and the Financial Times. Now, of course, most working people know that this economy is very rotten for working people, but it's been very interesting to see the reporting and what people have been focusing on, sort of showing signs that this economy might be in trouble. And of course, immediately everyone's been saying, well, this is nothing to worry about. But there are certainly worrying things. Of course, Trump's trade nonsense with China still is starting to it really has not manifested yet. And when that starts to hit, we're going to see a lot more tightening up of economic activity and investment. Bloomberg estimates that the trade war is going to wipe out the equivalent of $585 billion worth of economic activity that would have occurred without the trade war. So there's certainly going to be a tightening. And the real measure that we should be watching is whether or not business investment is going to be dropping in this next quarter, which is very likely, given the bleak out, the nonsense going on with Brexit, the China trade deal, and also these kind of worrying signs that we're seeing with like the yield curve inversion. But just one thing, with business investment, we've talked about this before. So much of this investment has been focused on IP, intellectual property investment, which is predominantly just trying to gain as many rents as you can out of the economy. So the question is, has this business investment even been sort of pushed toward a direction of the economy that's not going to be able to manifest outside of a time?
David, really quick, explain what you mean by rents. That's important.
Yeah, I mean, so basically you're having IP and you create a new technology or even a new technique, and you prevent opponents from, competitors from being able to use that technology, or that you're able to sell it off to lots of different,
and
organizations.
this could be in tech, which strangles innovation and creates rent squatter space for something like Microsoft Word, but it could also be in pharmaceuticals or public health.
Certainly pharmaceuticals, and also the torture box that Amazon patented a little while ago. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it was like a timeout box for workers. Anyway, Amazon was like, we patent everything. So, that's something that's definitely worrying, because this is not necessarily something, not that all IP investment is necessarily bad. It just has been the driving focus of a lot of corporations to be able to gobble up as much intellectual property as possible. That's the worrying factor. Now, now that we're starting to see this worrying moment, though, we really have to remember that this recovery has really been a recoveryless recovery for working people. It's been a recovery that's been fueled on debt. Credit card debt has only continued to increase since the financial crisis. Student loan debt has exploded. Private household debt has exploded. And, just recently there's been a lot of worrying signs of people missing car payments, which is also a very dangerous indicator that things aren't going very well for most working people. And this is supposed to be, a time of relative prosperity with the low unemployment numbers, and we're seeing more and more that that's not necessarily translating into a better situation for working people, because the fundamentals of our economy are absolutely broken. And now we're in a moment where the Federal Reserve has basically been trying to float the economy for a very long time on basically sugar rushes. And they're so low. I mean, Trump has been sort of bullying around the Federal Reserve to continue to keep interest rates low. And I'm not necessarily going to jump into that discussion about whether or not they should do that. But the reality is that there's a severe limit in fiscal policy that the Federal Reserve can continue to pursue. And the strategy following the financial crisis has been very limited in its ability to actually create a vibrant economy for most working people. And just worrying enough, today marked the FDIC and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency approved changes to the Volcker Rule. And the Volcker Rule was put in after the financial crisis that was supposed to stop prop trading, which was a major factor in the financial crisis initially, which is basically the banks were leveraging their capital to create, small bets, and if those did not hit, were very much exposed. And what happened is in the financial crisis, there was such a squeeze that all of this risk that these public banks, that these private banks had been taking on, basically exploded, and there was a huge, everyone was trying to get their money out, and basically banks stopped lending to each other. It was a massive disaster. And of course, the $16 billion lost by the six biggest lenders were immediately bailed out by the United States government. But the worry is basically this kind of very dangerous practice that the Obama administration stopped. And by the way, the Obama administration stopped in such, a half-assed way. Goldman Sachs was in the room when they crafted this rule, and they were very influential in actually making it as complicated as it was. So this is a big thing. They say, it's really complicated, we don't know what it is. Well, they were in the room actually fighting to make it more complicated because they want to use that as an opportunity to pull it away. So now, of course, under a Trump administration, they're trying to push so much deregulation that we really are entering into a moment where the kind of reckless activity that created the crisis is being reintroduced to a situation of massive stagnation in working class wages, and also a real serious moment of a lack of ability for the Federal Reserve if they use their traditional playbook. There's things that a central bank can do, but the way that the Federal Reserve has operated in the entire modern history of the United States, right, does not have a lot of tools to use. So when we're talking about this potential of a recession, we really are in a dangerous situation without a kind of real radical movement to start talking about debt, to start talking about workers' movements, and we cannot rely on fiscal stimulus from the Federal Reserve anymore, and we need to have a much bolder approach to dealing with the fundamental contradictions of capitalism that continue to lead us into constant modes of crisis, constantly.
As Richard Wolff says, if capitalism was your roommate, you'd want to move out.
That's actually a phenomenal line.
I mean, it's a great analogy. It's just like, yes, we just have a system where every several years, pretty much inevitably, the entire world goes into catastrophe. Well, I want to do you want to do the two stories after, Anna? Or let's do two quick stories. So one, this is really important. Peter Beinart was on CNN. And this story, first of all, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are going to be targeted by Republicans. They're going to be race baited and demonized by Trump. They're going to be lied about by Fox News, all of this stuff. And the real striking cowardice and disgusting sort of breakout is the Chuck Schumers, the Nancy Pelosi's, the people who will throw them under the bus. The broader context and the broader reality is that everything that they're saying about what Israel and Palestine is this is objective reality. I mean, the objective description of Israel being a Jim Crow system in the occupied territories this is analogous. I mean, this is as close, and I'm always resisting this because politics is not math. It is not science. And it is not solved by those means.
It's not logic?
It is not logic. Those are second order tools. But you have to understand power. You have to understand history. You have to understand the deeper dynamics that actually drive politics. But the objective description of what the situation is, what apartheid is in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine, is, on the face of it, some of the most simple and clear things to understand in politics. If you have a historical understanding of the American South, if you have an understanding of apartheid South Africa, pre-democratic South Africa, you understand that. If you have an understanding of Western Sahara, some dynamics in Northern Ireland, though, frankly, even though it was colonized and highly repressive, definitely not repressive to the same degree that the Palestinians are oppressed. Then you have a siege in Gaza. We can talk about the different political dynamics within Palestine. And as I always say, on one hand, it is absurd and ludicrous for anybody to demand and pass judgment on how anybody wages their struggle in a real situation like this. That is separate. So violence versus nonviolence, we have no comment on. That's not for us to talk about. We could talk about it strategically, maybe. Things like blowing up a roller skating rink of teenagers, which absolutely has happened in the past and Hamas is engaged in. Yes, we have to categorically reject that as wrong, because if we don't categorically reject certain tactics wielded by anybody, then we don't have a ground upon which to sort of establish some commonalities. That's apparent and that's fine. But the reality is that the broader question of the rhetoric around struggle and violence of Palestine, nobody outside of Palestine should have any comment on it. Period. Full stop. Case closed. And also on a practical level, every discussion about violence, so-called, from the Palestinians, even though that has pretty much been entirely a non-factor, essentially in reality, for at least a decade, unless we're going to get into some type of farcical kites conversation, is whataboutism to obscure the resistance to apartheid. And the great irony is that the prime vehicle of that resistance that has any impact in the world is nonviolent boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which those who defend Israel anywhere, anytime, any place are more upset about than anything else. Peter Beinart is a moderate. He has a background as a far-right hawk. I guess he would call himself a liberal interventionist in terms of foreign policy. But he's a man of conscience. And really, I will say this as someone who spent some brief time in Ramallah myself, you would have to be devoid of any basic human response to not be disgusted by that situation. And this was a very important sort of clarity on CNN.
Palestinians don't have to be saints in order to deserve the basic rights that all of us take for granted, right? Miftah has said things that I disagree with. They made an anti-Semitic statement that they apologized for. The point is, when you go there, I say this as an American Jew. My children go to Jewish day school. I lead services in an Orthodox synagogue. Judaism is the center of my life. The first time I went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank, it was a shattering experience. The only thing I could imagine would be similar for American would be going to visit the Jim Crow South. When you see people living under the control of the state with no rights, they cannot become citizens. They cannot vote for the state that controls their lives. They do not have free movement. They need a pass to move from city to city. They live under a military legal system. The consequences are more brutal than we can imagine sitting here. So, do I agree with Miftah? Of course not. I had a close friend who was killed in a suicide bombing. But Palestinians don't. You could have made the same argument if you went to visit SNCC and said, oh, they were connected with communists. Some of their people have made anti-white statements. The point is, what Ilhan Omar said is the most important point. People need to go and see for themselves. I've never seen anyone who's gone and seen for themselves and not been transformed by the experience.
Anyone to be associated with a group that supports terrorism. And this isn't black or white. I mean, they publish this stuff. No one's forcing them to publish
years
this
ago,
stuff.
there were certain statements on their website. Hana Nasrawi has devoted her life as a nonviolent activist to opposing an oppression which none of us which does not accord with the values that any of us believe in as Americans.
So she doesn't control her own organization and what it publishes?
Rich, why don't you try spending a little bit of time focusing on the fact that almost $4 billion of U.S. aid is used to put children in detention.
You're the one distracting from the issue. I'm asking
No, this is the issue. You're distracting from the issue because National Review, just as National Review defended apartheid, and just as you defended segregation, you now defend Israel's oppression of Palestinian basic rights. It's a tradition for you guys.
Look, and if an organization supports terrorism, that organization should be beyond the pale.
And when Palestinians protest nonviolently, right, you discredit them as well.
So you're saying that, in some sense, justifies terrorism?
Of course it doesn't justify what they want. I've said again and again, I disagree with terrorism. What I'm saying is you're trying to distract from the real issue. The real issue is American complicity in the denial of basic Palestine.
Well, first of all, it's 100% right. And yes, it's absolutely, you are the legacy heir of apartheid and Jim Crow South if you defend Israel in its occupation and siege and denial of democratic rights. More broadly, I mean, this is something that's extraordinary to me because everybody picks their place to not want to, in this case, acknowledge the fundamental issue, which is the oppression of Palestinians. And two, nobody wants to deal with the simple, but apparently for a lot of people, disturbing reality that reasons and understanding is not justification. And that's an understanding that you need to apply to any number of situations in order to have a proper analysis. Matt, really quickly, what do you do with Rich Lowry, that sociopath on Twitter?
Yeah, so what you do is ask him why they don't digitize the National Review archives.
That's interesting. Does it have something to do with what Peter Beinart was saying about supporting the Jim Crow South and apartheid South Africa?
Yeah, I'm looking for this cover here. I don't know if this is it. They had one in 1957 called Why the South Must Prevail. It might be because they don't want people to be able to find Mandela or Rhodesia or Jim Crow.
Well, I'm sure that they were totally for freeing Nelson Mandela and overturning apartheid South Africa. It must be that the reason that they don't care about Palestinian children in detention or the mass murder of Palestinian civilians is because people like William F. Buckley were known for their extreme support of the Jewish people.
Yeah, casual cross burner.
Yes, they were very, very tough on the old anti-Semitism thing. So that's important. That's really important. That's stated clearly and unequivocally.
I mean, that was a masterful rhetorical performance there.
Yes.
I mean, just the way he is able to answer Lowry's just sniveling troll, which is, I mean,
just disgusting. And you'll get this, by the way, in your day-to-day life too, and respond in precisely the same way.
Well, this is the exact same thing that Hitchens had in his. I don't know if we want to get into it now.
We did the throwback. We did a segment actually with Hitchens and Sullivan, where Sullivan was playing the same old violin, and even neocon Hitchens was able to disaggregate the distinction between borderless metaphysical aspirational terrorism and political violence rooted in resistance to occupation. Yeah, we can play a second of this.
Join with Saddam and the Saudis and many other Arab regimes in a fanatical Hitlerian anti-Semitism that wants to see Israel taken off the map. Now, the other difference is quite obvious. Israel is not threatening the world with giving terrorist entities weapons of mass destruction to
We'll skip through Hitchens a little bit here.
Yes.
And that Arabs have. If it didn't have those defenses, it would have been obliterated long ago. And you know it. And you know that these surrounding powers want Israel destroyed. Almost none of them even acknowledge its right to exist, and are fomenting terrorism against its civilians, which is exactly the same as the terrorism fomented against us.
The UN resolutions that have been violated, you talk about all these violations occurred well before anyone had heard of, or before there was such an organization as Hezbollah, which arose incidentally in response to a completely illegal Israeli aggression and occupation in South Lebanon.
Are you denying that Hezbollah has very close ties with Islamist fundamentalism and terrorism?
Hezbollah, it means a party of God. Which
so why are you ambivalent about it?
I think gives a clue about its views about theocracy.
You who argue against theocratic terrorism are giving Hezbollah a pass?
Hezbollah was the organizer of the resistance to an illegal, criminal Israeli occupation.
Well, don't you think that Al-Qaeda...
They had every right, they had under international law every right to resist and repel that occupation.
Don't you think you could use the same argument about Al-Qaeda resisting the tyranny in Saudi Arabia?
Quite obviously not. Al-Qaeda is not fighting an occupation.
It seems to me
Al-Qaeda is fighting to establish...
You actually defend terrorism when it's directed against Israel, but not against the rest of the world?
It is not terroristic for a Lebanese citizen...
It is not terroristic to have suicide bombing?
It is not terroristic for a Lebanese citizen to resist a foreign occupation of his country. He has international laws on his side.
Hezbollah is not about Lebanese citizens resisting anything. Hezbollah is about the destruction of Israel, the use of terroristic tactics to kill innocent civilians. Now, why can't you condemn that?
That's what I mean by the...
Isn't Hezbollah the enemy?
That's what I meant earlier, Andrew, when I said that the word terrorism has become effectively useless because of propagandization and diminishing returns.
You will not condemn Hezbollah?
International law gives the right of the Palestinians and the Lebanese to resist
First
occupation.
Of all, the Lebanese, as you know full well, is a complete
Al-Qaeda is not a guerrilla organization fighting occupation.
Hezbollah is an international terrorist group funded in part from the mullahs in Iran that you despise, and yet you will not condemn it for its suicide attacks on Israel and its use of terrorist tactics.
I'm emphasizing what isn't obvious, Andrew. Okay,
well, I'd like you to emphasize just for the record what is obvious.
I'm emphasizing what isn't obvious, Andrew, is still one of the lines of the century. But that's it. And that's adult. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with having a specific because under international norms, and we can't resort to law. Law is not going to save us. Law is subordinate to power, no doubt. But there are legal justifications upon which a state engages in military action and how the ground rules of how they're supposed to do that. Israel's in violation of every one of those laws and precedents every time it bombards Gaza, a place that has the population density of Queens. It's a giant open-air prison, and they kill hundreds of civilians. That's a violation. You go back to the Goldstone report, Operation Cast Lead, endless war crimes committed by Israel. So I have no problem saying, look, if you shoot a rocket specifically to kill a civilian, yes, that is a war crime. The broader context of a guerrilla organization in an occupied country has a right to resist as they see fit. That's an uncontroversial point to anybody who's an adult and has any understanding of politics, law, history, and basic reality. And that even being said, it is a relatively broad consensus now that for a variety of reasons, BDS is the most effective tactic, which is a nonviolent tactic. Go back several years of which that the same people who brush aside the murder, oppression, and apartheid of Palestinians, that have no regard for Palestinian life, that constantly fearmonger and overhype the Palestinian threat, that don't care about Palestinian lives, they would have the temerity to twist their mouths into saying, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Where's the Palestinian Mandela? Well, first of all, Mandela at one point absolutely said that armed struggle was part of the resistance against apartheid. And secondly, Mandela said South Africa is not free till the Palestinians are free. And thirdly, you have them now. People calling for nonviolent boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And now the move in the United States is to literally eliminate people's democratic and constitutional freedoms so they cannot exercise their conscience to economically oppose apartheid state. Let that really sink in. I want to do this Lula thing. We'll do it just for a minute, and then we'll play this Ana interview. As I said, I'm really proud. And do we have that video ready? I AM'd it to you with a time code and everything. I'm incredibly proud that we have covered this story from the beginning. Freeing Lula is a human rights necessity. The elections in 2018 are fundamentally illegitimate because he was put in jail in a fraudulent political and corrupt process by Lava Jato. And having Bolsonaro as president has global implications. We talked about the ecocide in the Amazon. We'll be talking about that more on the show. When you have a leader like this in prison, it is the destruction of a very important leader and someone who, the biggest political talent on earth is in jail right now. Everybody should be agitating about that. And particularly in the United States, because absolutely the United States had a role in this process. But even if you're just more broadly concerned about this overturning this tide, the most strategic country in Latin America is in the hands of a brutal, vicious, grotesque clown fascist because of a corrupt, fraudulent process which put the greatest leader in Brazil's history in prison and the best president of the 21st century. If you consider what the best being by who took the most human beings out of poverty, who has provided the best sense of possibility, democracy, and social justice, that is President Lula. And so I want to remind everybody, this is part of a video that we just did. It's an illicit history for $21 and above patrons. This clip of Lula at that last rally before he voluntarily turned himself into prison. He said in an interview last week for a station in Brazil, he said, look, he hasn't said it as explicitly before. He's like, I could have left. I absolutely could have left this country and avoided being a political prisoner in this grotesque process. But he chose. He said, it's better for me to be inside a jail fighting our enemies here. That's the clarity of this leadership, and we need to match it because it's a justice in and of itself. It's solidarity with Brazil. And this move of the pieces that put this man in jail, that starts at the Justice Department, that starts with a reversal of the pink tide and goes all the way down to scumbag Steve Bannon's little global fascist campaign. This is a major win on their side that we need to reverse. So this is a clip of Lula before he went to prison. Let this sink in. It's incredibly powerful.
Dictatorship before them.
Oh, sorry.
Eu quero saber quantos dias eles vão pensar que estão me prendendo. E quanto mais dias eles me deixarem lá, mais Lula vai nascer nesse país e mais gente vai querer brigar nesse país. Porque a democracia não tem limite, não tem hora pra gente brigar. Por isso que eu estou fazendo uma coisa muito consciente, mas muito consciente. Eu falei para os companheiros, se dependesse da minha vontade, eu não iria, mas eu vou. Eu vou porque eles vão dizer a partir da manhã que o Lula está foragido, que o Lula está escondido. Não, eu não estou escondido. Eu vou lá na barba deles, para eles saberem que eu não tenho medo, para eles saberem que eu não vou correr e para eles saberem que eu vou provar a minha inocência. Eu vou terminar com uma frase que eu peguei em 1982 numa menina de 10 anos em Catanduva, que eu não sei quem é. E essa frase não tem autor. A frase dizia: os poderosos podem matar uma, duas ou três rosas, mas jamais conseguirão deter a chegada da primavera. E a nossa luta é em busca da primavera.
We've got to keep agitating on this. And I would say the most serious criminal justice proposals, the most serious climate proposals, the only person to clearly support single payer and the only candidate to call for freeing Lula, to me, that's a Bernie Sanders point. Lula Livre, 500 days unjustly in prison. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with an interview that is not live. So if you have questions, I can't address them now because we recorded this a couple hours ago with the great Ana Kasparian. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Matt, I really like that interstitial a lot from the genius DJ Danarchy. Joining us now is another genius. She's a co-host and producer for the Young Turks. Ana Kasparian is with us. Ana, thanks so much for coming back.
It's always my pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to talk with you. So what we're going to talk about is this very disturbing symmetry that I think we all see every day if we're paying proper attention, but it might be even more deep and systemic than we realize between the sort of expressions of violence and right-wing extremism, but really more importantly, how they actually correlate at the very core of the Republican Party and Republican media. We're going to get to this Lou Dobbs clip in a second, but first I just wanted to get your general thoughts on that to orient us for our conversation.
Well, I see that there are several issues with how the media overall covers cases of extremists. And what I see is a lot of mainstream media outlets doing the dirty work for extreme right-wingers by regurgitating their narrative and drawing these false equivalencies between what they refer to as extremists on the left and then the true extremists on the right who have already carried out so many acts of violence that people have lost their lives. So you have that when it comes to establishment mainstream media. And then to make matters worse, on the right with individuals like Lou Dobbs, they will not only defame individuals on the left and paint this completely inaccurate picture of them, but he will also provide a cover for right-wing extremism and right-wing violence. And he does it in plain sight with absolutely no consequences. And this type of messaging encourages and incites the violence to continue.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that those sort of things on the continuum are really important because I think at times there might even be an overemphasis on the relative importance of groups that actually in the right political environment could be relatively easy to marginalize. The power they have is the whitewashing through so-called mainstream media and essentially the like wink and nod sometimes more from the mainstream of the Republican Party and from media. And a really glaring example of this is a clip that you actually brought to my attention of Lou Dobbs from the other day. I think a lot of people have seen this really disturbing, disgusting footage of the protesters in front of an ICE facility protesting the kidnapping of children, an ICE facility in Rhode Island, and an ICE employee essentially driving his truck through them resisting, and actually they ended up getting pepper sprayed by local ICE employees. This is how Lou Dobbs presented that story on Fox Business just the other day.
ICE protesters in Rhode Island harassing a federal detention center worker last night. These demonstrators blocking the entrance to a facility holding illegal immigrants. When the driver tried to pull in to the parking lot, the protesters surrounded him, yelling, banging on the hood of the truck, blocking his entrance into the facility. In jurisdictions all around the country, by the way, what they committed is assault. Trying to stop and block a vehicle is considered assault. In some instances, banging on an occupied vehicle is considered assault, which obviously the demonstrators may have committed in Rhode Island last night. Joining us tonight, Tom Homan, former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
I mean, you get it goes on, basically Dobbs essentially praising the guy for doing that. it's overused word, but that seems kind of Orwellian.
I mean, beyond Orwellian. And also, I mean, right-wing hypocrisy is something that we've become so used to that I think that the majority of Americans, including us on the left, have become completely desensitized to it. I mean, these are individuals who want to get in between women and their doctors and make decisions about their reproductive choices for them because they claim that they really value life. And then at the same time, you hear them making excuses for prison guards who are literally attempting to murder protesters who they disagree with. Also, let's just keep in mind that, again, these are protesters. They're practicing their First Amendment right. They were sitting as they were practicing that First Amendment right and protesting these migrant detention centers. And, you know, you have this individual trying to run them over, and their lives don't matter. Their political speech doesn't matter. And I'm very curious where all those free speech warriors are, right? Where's Dave Rubin? Where's Ben Shapiro? Where's Ann Coulter? Where are all these people who only seem to care about protecting First Amendment rights when their precious speech money is on the line on college campuses? I mean, what's happening right now is beyond Orwellian. It's terrifying. It's a form of intimidation. So protesters don't voice their concerns over the way that migrants are being brutalized and dehumanized in these migrant detention centers. And Never Again Action, which is a group of Jewish activists who are calling these detention centers concentration camps, are doing something so incredibly important. They're saying, look, not on our watch. We know what this is all about. We know what it's like to be victimized this way, and we're not going to let it happen to any other group of people. And that is the exact type of speech that the right wing is so angry about, to the point where they will make excuses for people trying to run them over and murder them with their trucks. And this whole notion that it's assault to hit someone's car or bang on someone's car is just mind-blowing to me. I mean, they were about to be run over as they were sitting. They stood up at that point and tried to, defend themselves. And the guy, by the way, continued running through them. Luckily, no one was killed, but 6 people were hurt. There were children in that group. There was an individual in a wheelchair. I mean, we're incredibly lucky that no one got killed. But to see someone on national television, basically say this type of behavior is totally fine, go ahead and hit them with your car, I mean, that's what he's implying. And it's no wonder we see the type of violence throughout the country that we're seeing today. It's being completely excused by people like Lou Dobbs.
I mean, I just want to say, and I hate the phrase "to be fair," but I just do want to be fair that, Dave, as an example, is dealing with the fact that Family Guy doesn't make gay jokes anymore. So,
well, you know what?
There's a lot going on.
That is important.
There's a lot
That is very
going
important
on.
free speech.
I mean, it's a complicated world. And just because people are getting, run over for protesting doesn't mean that we can forget 2005 dog animated gay jokes.
Right. Well, I hate to bring him up again, but the issue of free speech is important.
Yes.
And to be fair to myself and to be fair to countless people on the left, we did defend right-wingers who wanted to give speeches on college campuses. You might disagree with the speech or the messaging coming from people on the right, but you can't stop someone from sharing their point of view or their ideas, right? You're supposed to be a little uncomfortable and you're supposed to be challenged on a college campus. But the thing that frustrates me, and I think what frustrates a lot of people on the left, is that while we're playing fair, we're also getting punched in the face by the right wing because they are hypocrites. They don't have any principles or values, and they won't turn around and protect the free speech rights of us on the left.
Of course.
And so,
Never.
one of the points that exactly. Yeah.
Never.
And one of the points that I haven't made on the Young Turks yet, but I've been thinking about quite a bit is, look, I don't agree with any type of violence carried out, regardless of which group is carrying it out. I don't like the milkshakes. I don't like, what Antifa sometimes does. I do not think that everyone in Antifa is violent. I think that they are being mischaracterized to a degree. But at the same time, I do understand the frustration. Because if there's no one out there who is doing the right thing and fighting against these fascists and fighting against these violent right-wingers, when you have the mainstream media regurgitating their nonsense talking points and drawing these false equivalencies, you feel helpless and you feel like you have to take matters into your own hands. That's what creates the violent situation. We're supposed to have leaders who actually represent us and call these disgusting human beings out. But has anyone called out Lou Dobbs? I mean, no one's even outraged about it. And it frustrates me, I mean, to no end. I can't stop thinking about this story because more lives are going to be lost over this right-wing violence in America.
Well, and you drew the really disturbing parallel and the correct one between the murder of Heather Heyer and that specific thing that we saw at that ICE detention facility. I want to broaden it because I think the other really important point of this, and I think that there's a lot of different interesting debates that people can have about Antifa, and to me, I think part of it is just like branding things properly, and I think that there's things to actually even learn, frankly, from even examples of sort of like dual tracks in a place like Northern Ireland. But, you know, we can get into that at maybe more so later on, but I just want to really underline that when you open up this real lens of looking at who is actually infringing on not just free speech, but really broad set of civil liberties, there have been in the last couple of years a set of local initiatives by Republican state legislatures to, as an example, in North Dakota at the height of the water protector protests, where people, of course, were protesting on behalf of native sovereignty and ecology over the interests of another predatory colonial, energy company. There was private security there aggressively monitoring people hired by the state. There was a bill in the state legislature to essentially make what that guard did legal, right? Which is that essentially if you hit a protester, you can get away with it. There's been bills in other parts of the country to make people responsible for like horrific, exorbitant fines if they engage in nonviolent civil disobedience because, well, that has an effect on the economy. So you actually have this whole other ring of areas. And again, I think it is actually a real shame that these people have turned rhetoric like free speech into a joke, because these things actually do have some importance. They actually do have significance, where regardless of where you're coming from politically, it would be delusional to not acknowledge that. And they have turned it into a joke, even as legislatively these things are actually being seriously encroached upon at the same time, of course, that we have ICE kidnapping children.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, just to go back to the legislation that you referenced, Rhode Island was one of the states that had proposed legislation that would allow for drivers to hit protesters, right? So they wouldn't have to worry about criminal charges if they happen to hit a protester. And the reason why I bring that up in the context of Rhode Island is not only because of what happened to the protesters, but also because Rhode Island was one of the states where state lawmakers who happen to be Democrats were in favor of it. And I bring that up because we need to, and we've, I think, done a decent job as progressives in holding Democrats accountable when they're wrong. But these are people who need to be primary, they need to be challenged, and they need to be voted out of office because they are anti-democracy. They do not represent true left-wing values, and they don't represent constitutional values or constitutional rights. It is absolutely disgusting that anyone would sign on to that type of legislation. Luckily, it's been shelved. I think that it would be challenged in the courts anyway, and you know, who knows how that would go, considering how right-wingers have really stacked the courts against us over the last few decades. But, you know, we're dealing with something incredibly scary, and I'm not the type who likes to fearmonger, but we really need to take a step back and think about the rhetoric that's being used, the way these types of instances of violence are being covered in the media, and more importantly, just like the lack of outrage that I'm seeing when it comes to this type of behavior. One other thing I wanted to note is that when Andy Ngo was, assaulted by some members of Antifa, immediately there were individuals who were arrested. In the case of the protesters nearly getting run over by this prison guard in Rhode Island, he didn't get arrested. The district attorney is considering it. He's looking into it. He should have been arrested immediately. If any one of us did what that prison guard did, we would be arrested immediately.
What do you make of the lack of outrage?
I think a few things are happening. I think the news cycle is constantly flooded. So no one's talking about El Paso anymore. Right. I mean, the person who carried out that mass shooting had a racist manifesto posted online, pretty soon before he committed that act of violence. No one's talking about it because the cycle's flooded. And it's something that I think a lot of people are grappling with on a daily basis. I mean, I feel guilty because I don't know what to focus on. I don't know how to strategically put a rundown together in the most responsible way possible. Because again, as soon as you think you have the right rundown of stories, there's something egregious happening. There's some news story. The Trump administration floods the cycle, which is why in a recent episode of No Filter, I kind of lost it and, went off the cuff and went into this rage because the big story was, Trump saying racist things about Elijah Cummings. And the big debate was, is Trump racist?
Right.
Can we please stop having that damn debate? Yes, he's racist. Got it. We don't need to cover every tweet. We don't need to cover every controversial thing he says. He's a terrible person. We all know this. We need to be more strategic in what we cover, how we cover it, and we need to figure out a way to apply pressure and continue applying pressure so we get real change.
Yeah, and I think this actually bridges, because we're going to talk in the last couple of minutes about the vampire castle and sort of like strategy for the left. But I mean, do you think that there's also, part of it, and I know, some people don't find anything the guy says or does funny, and I totally respect that. Obviously, I and people like Waz have like we still get amused by how ridiculous he is. Like, we talked about the A$AP Rocky tweets on Woke Bros. But it does seem to me that, like, even if you just think he's totally repulsive and disgusting, full stop, which is probably the most accurate and best way to feel about him, that there is something like that dynamic you're talking about. And I loved that commentary on No Filter because I felt like you also hit at like just this real, obviously it's not a symmetry. People reacting to Trump's racism are correct. But just this feedback loop where it's like he can monopolize the attention economy anytime. We all know he's going to say something. We all know it's going to be either gross or maybe at times going to be kind of funny. And then everybody has their predicted answer. I mean, I still see people replying to Trump tweets where he'll say like, Scaramucci's a loser. And someone will say like, you hired him, you effing idiot. And it's like, dude, just let him, like, it's bad enough he's president. We actually have to deal with this man and really everything he represents. But then it's like, do we still need to have this like obsessive emotional relationship to him? I don't think it's healthy or strategic.
I 100% agree with you. And it really does take away from important conversations and important analysis that needs to be had. So I'll give you an example I came across today as I was preparing a story about the criminal justice reform legislation, or I should say proposals coming from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So I want to find analysis that's going to do a thorough job in looking into these two proposals, finding their differences. I mean, you would think that these massive, well-funded cable news outlets would at least spend a little bit of time and their resources into looking at these proposals and comparing and contrasting them, right? Here at TYT, we have, and I'm not even exaggerating, we have a team of 4 people putting together a 3-hour show every single day, and that's a lot of work. And sometimes you come across proposals that, you need to focus on pretty much the entire day to make sure you're doing that proposal justice. Anyway, I come across a panel discussion on MSNBC, and they're specifically focusing on Bernie Sanders. I know that they have complete and utter disdain for him, but I was thinking, who knows, maybe there's someone on this panel who will point out something that I might have missed in reading about Bernie's proposal. All they said was he falls short. He didn't really care about criminal justice reform until now, and it's because he's trying to garner support among black voters. I mean, it was unbelievable. Disgusting. And so it is disgusting. And so they will have a very lengthy conversation about Trump's racism, as if that hasn't already been adjudicated. But do they actually care about covering and doing fair analysis on proposals that would really improve the lives of Americans? Of course not. Of course not. So, by the way, I didn't mean to repeat myself.
Oh, that was Trump style. He's doing the haiku now. So sad.
I know.
So sad. Thank you.
So
Thank
sad.
you. Unfair. I mean, but you know, maybe actually, I think maybe if it's cool, we'll get in another couple of weeks, we'll have the left conversation, because I just want to stay on this media tip for a minute. MSNBC has really outdone itself in this cycle in terms of like not just what you'd expect, which is obviously a bias against Sanders and a bias, frankly, even just really crudely against an agenda that could have implications for hosts' tax brackets and for the media conglomerate that owns the company. And I'm sorry, if you think that's conspiratorial, then you're just shockingly naive to not think that people have self-interest. But like, do you find something... And again, maybe something so revealing about the fact that not just are they opposed to it, but that they have this like, I just can't get over the bizarre, weird, obsessive hatred of Sanders. And also, I'd like to actually juxtapose that with the point you keep making about Trump, which is so important, which is that not only has it been already adjudicated, and we don't mean like, oh, that's old news, whatever. It matters every second that our president is a white supremacist bigot. But the point is that every time you recycle that conversation and ask, is it really so, you're actually cheapening the topic.
Yes. And also, it's just, when I say that it's been adjudicated, I don't mean that you shouldn't cover the instances of racism or the racist statements coming from Trump. I think the proper way to cover those stories at this point is to talk about it, condemn it for what it is, which is racism, and avoid having the same ridiculous debate as if it hasn't been adjudicated, right? So condemning it is important, because there are people who are receiving serious threats, whose lives are being risked, and people who have already died because of the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration. But at the same time, and this is my suspicion, it's very easy to have that debate, right? Yes. Because it distracts from the very policies that these wealthy cable news hosts don't want to give any airtime to. I mean, I think we forget that most of these people have multi-million-dollar contracts. Most of these people don't want to pay more in taxes. You know, when Jake Tapper is asking about whether these policies coming from progressives is going to increase middle-class tax rates, you think he's really concerned about middle-class tax rates? No, he's concerned about the money he's making. And I don't think that it's impossible for someone to be wealthy and still, care about progressive policies and want to focus on and shed light on progressive policies. But I think what we're seeing in cable news with most of these hosts is, look, they're living in a completely different world. They don't know what it's like to struggle to put food on the table for your kids. They don't know what it's like to not have a way of getting to work, or not knowing whether or not you're going to be able to pay rent the next day. They don't know what it's like to live in a freaking RV on the streets of Los Angeles and have this constant fear that it's going to be towed because there's a 2-hour parking limit on the street that you're parked on. They don't know what that's like. So these policies are, to them, is just, what are they going to do? Are they going to take more of my pay away from me? Are they going to, are they going to get rid of these tax cuts? That's what they're concerned about. And I think that's the reason why they have so much disdain for so many of these policies.
Middle-class people balancing having to pay property taxes on a home in the Hamptons, Upper East Side in Connecticut. As a final question, because I know you got to go in a minute, but whether we're talking about, and we will talk about the Vampire Castle essay and how the left can be more inviting and strategic, or even dealing with all of the themes we've been talking about tonight, my question is, can we all just be, and I'm going to be a pure stan here, can we all just be a little bit more like Cornel West? Is that possible?
I think the world would be a much better place if we could all be more like Cornel West. He's so non-judgmental and inspiring. I listen to him on days where I want to go in a rage and I want to go on air and say incredibly mean things about the right wing. Mm-hmm. You have to be strategic. You really do. Because if you come at them, or if you come at independents, I mean, Trump supporters are Trump supporters. At this point, if they still support him, they're a lost cause.
Right.
But there are people who aren't as politically aware. I mean, you got to remember, most people don't live in the bubble we live in.
Absolutely.
Where we live and breathe this stuff. It's our job. Most people are struggling. They have to work multiple jobs, and they don't have that resource of time to sit down and really do the type of analysis that we do. So if they're relying on us or other left-wing shows on social media platforms, it's important for us to, convey a message in a very non-judgmental way. We need to be more appealing to people, and you're not going to be appealing if you always attack individuals for not using the exact correct language that you want.
Right.
Yep. We need to put our own personal preferences aside and try to communicate with others in a way that, will kind of pull them to our side so they can see that the proposals coming from progressives makes the most sense economically and morally.
And that, not for a sec, and that has nothing to do with anything with compromising on any core values. It's all about this, like, sometimes real derailment of like obsession with like certain types of like social positioning outside of this, broader commitment to the policy set and the values, and then also really just like the ethos that somebody that Cornel West brings forward, which is both uncompromisingly radical, but also cognizant of appealing to a broad, of a broad set of human beings across the world, and also humble because we all have to grow.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I love about him the most. His ability to point to someone like Donald Trump, call him a gangster, and then immediately follow that with, I recognize that he's a gangster because I have gangster in me.
Right.
It's just this moment of self-reflection that I think that we are all capable of, and I think we should do a little more of.
Ana Kasparian, you are so on point. And also, of course, everybody, listen to on podcast and subscribe to No Filter, which is what I do, because I need the undiluted, the uncut, the No Filter. And then, of course, also on The Young Turks, where she is a co-host and producer. Ana Kasparian, thank you so much, as always.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
Welcome back, folks. Here's what we're going to do. We've got a jam-packed post-game, which is, of course, going to start with Ben Burgess and the debunk. We're talking about the UK, Brexit, the Tory menace, Kashmir. And then Jeremy Johnson is a very interesting writer and digital explorer. He's going to come and introduce us to some idea. Actually, if you're a patron and you listen to the Integral Theory Primer, you'll be familiar with some of this stuff, but it'll be new. And it will be some actual outside of the box thinking, unlike so many people who pretend to do that, but don't. So sad. So sad. Thank you. Thank you. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. That's how this whole thing happens. And we continue to grow, make more offerings, and do more things, and invest in more. 3,000 patrons. Let's get there quick. See you in Chicago this weekend. No show next week, but a new public feeded podcast and all of the usual patron shows in the first week of September. We're going to actually have a Monday show, and the guest is going to be Congressman Ro Khanna. And then the following week, Crystal Ball and Mike Racine. Thanks, everybody.